abilities. Seems more hardware is doing so. Anyway, okay, coming back to the topic of choice then today, because that's done for me. You guys see something? That's good. Everyone sees something. It's always a sensible thing. So continuing a little bit through our further sessions. Next week we'll probably also have an introduction of selected projects for you guys. And another thing. Yes, right. Instead of assignment 4, which hasn't been announced yet. Good. We'll merge that with the project itself. Right, so instead of having you go through yet another assignment, the idea was, okay, why can't we just extend the project a bit, right? So, and require certain features to be integrated there. But so that's basically the idea. So you don't have to expect a fourth assignment, please.
How big groups are we supposed to have on the assignment?
Good one. I mean, we had massively variable sizes because we give you guys considerable freedom in terms of the scope of the project, right? So more people usually implies bigger projects, but also implies more coordination overhead, which is kind of a bit of a pain, right? So, I mean, while groups of 2 are often sensible, we would also admit larger groups if the project warrants that, right? If it has, for example, front and back end or sufficiently complex interaction, for example, that it's differentiated by parsing something, perhaps some AI integrated by this, and so on. So if you can really decompose your project nicely, then we'll also admit larger groups, of course, of 3 or 4 people max. But the 2 people concept is probably the dominating one, and it was the most successful one. So especially, you should, yeah. On that note, it's probably a good opportunity. Do you guys, if you guys have any projects you want to pursue, not any project you already have pursued, that's slightly different. But if you want to do some extended projects in Android, that's a good opportunity right now, right? So even to jumpstart an idea, but of course it needs to have a certain complexity. So it actually shows that you have developed a skill set and requires you to develop more skill sets. So not just applying what you already know.
Something related to D&D, for example, could we make something like that? Just an app that lets you show some information and such, and lets you track some data.
Yeah, in principle, yes, yeah, but it shouldn't just be, capturing form information and sending it to some servers on the internet, but do something with this. A bit of post-processing or visualization, for example, or something a bit more involved. Yeah.
Yeah. Another one is trying to render, for example, if I wanted to try to render that. The 9 moons and all of that I spoke of previously, trying to do that one.
Rendering, interesting. So you want to use OpenGLES or?
And I'm just coming up with possibilities.
Stuff. Yeah, that's the kind of worms there. But I think it's a good opportunity to brainstorm and then come back and we can discuss nearly on a kind of, unless there's broad interest in your project on a one-to-one basis and say, okay, that's a sensible project, or between you and your partner and so on. I would encourage people to definitely work in teams. Alone is kind of a tough one. Also, it limits your scope in terms of what you do, and you lose the benefit of extreme programming, for example, which I think works really well in this course, because you can be torn in different directions, right? So think about persistence on the one hand, API use on the other one. Try new libraries and so on. It makes for good explorative exercises. If you're doing it alone, you're likely ending up doing kind of something you kind of know already in a way. So for being out there and trying something new and working across those hurdles, it's usually helpful to have a second buddy to bounce off ideas, of course, right? To develop together with. So if you have ideas, please start collating them, and then I think probably next week and so on. Probably next week. I think we need to start with this. We're still okay. No, we're still okay. I think next week we'll see whether we prioritize the peer review or that. But anyway, you should start thinking about some ideas, brainstorming. We'll post some on the wiki. Perhaps Marsh has done it already because we discussed that, and then we go from there. So then you need to hone in on some subjects. We have some externals as well that have some ideas about mobile applications, and they will present them here in this course. I'm not sure when exactly. Cool. That out of the way. Anything else on my mental list? Morally confused because my machine was not cooperating, and I realized how dependent I am in the meantime on it. Anyway, So one of the subjects that we kind of need to talk about, especially in the context of mobile devices, of course, right? Because that's the biggest growing market in terms of consumer technologies. Oh, well, growing. The biggest market, growing is a relative term because the relative sales of mobile devices haven't gone down. But it's not always in US or in Norway where development happens, right? So it's in other places of the planet as well. And unlike more traditional means by which you actually have a fixed customer or well-defined customer for which you develop, mobile applications lend themselves well for distribution via app stores, for example, right? So something we haven't really talked about, but either way, the point is, as soon as you deploy it on app stores, you have the opportunity or the option at least to go global with this, right? So have a wider audience, wider catchment. And in this slide, it's also important to accommodate this, of course, the broader audience. And the reason why I bring it up now, of course, you're building projects that you don't necessarily share on any app store, even though you can of course, is that you want to consider some aspects from the get-go, right? So specifically internationalization and localization. So to start off, what's that anyway? Internationalization, localization. Is there a difference? The same? What is it? Anyone? Please.
Localization can be having in your apps for different languages like Norwegian, English, German,
yeah,
and having the user experience be the same, and the text and the strings at least be the same, have the same meaning in all, in your native language.
Yeah. So which term was that?
Localization.
Okay, and the other one? Is it the same thing? Who thinks it's the same thing? Perhaps it is. It's a quiz, come on. Who thinks it's the same? Internationalization, localization. Who thinks it's not the same? Counter check. Who is actually awake? Okay, one, good, fail. That's on me. Okay, well, it's of course not the same, right? But it's closely related. So the idea is really that we are precisely as you say, right? We're adapting specifically localization, a app to support arbitrary number of languages or specific or fixed set of languages, and respects the conventions, meanings, and so on of those languages, of course. But the whole concept goes probably, hopefully, slightly beyond that as well, as we'll explore in a second. So, of course, on the one hand, of course, we need to accommodate the global customer base that we probably have as app developers. But it also goes beyond. In the meantime, if we think about internationalization, we also think about accessibility more widely. Because not everyone, can deal with acoustic devices, let alone visual devices. If you guys were first year, I would throw a stone or something, but in second and third year, I'm a bit more diligent. Hey guys. Cool, cheers, thanks. Slightly, yeah. So the idea is basically we need to accommodate an arbitrary audience, right? So that can, of course, be a global audience, but it may also be different means of, accessibility or impairment that need to be considered. But fundamentally, the idea of internationalization, that's the first term here. So usually conventionally abbreviated as I18N, and localization as L10N, just to count the number of letters, because it's like the notorious need for abbreviation is, of course, sensible. And fundamentally, what we're talking about is the process of writing a program or modifying a program in a way so that it can support multiple languages without requiring any semantic changes to code itself, right? So the idea is to externalize all that language stuff, right? Get it out of the code base. So to make the application as flexible as possible without touching the code ideally. It also means that, of course, the person that deals with the internationalization fundamentally may not even be the developer anymore, right? So deal with translations and things like this, precisely as you mentioned. So it's part of the idea to disentangle this a bit. So it's a bit of a cross-cutting concern, if you like. It's a bit like logging. Logging also should be separate from the code base where possible, and only invoked where sensible. Yeah, that's part of that approach. And of course, it's kind of a cyclic problem, because every time you modify code, you need to revisit that code base as well and figure out, okay, is there a way that we need to adapt the code further, or can externalize further properties? The reason why we bring it up is that in most mobile applications as of now, you probably haven't considered in the first place, and most people do it, don't really do it until like the last minute or something. But I think it's actually something fairly straightforward to be considered from the get-go. And the obvious advantages we always sell when we talk about development are, of course, do it early, so we don't have that problem. You keep a wide audience, so especially if you don't know your target audience yet. Sometimes if you are developing a product or an application that is to be used for multiple years, your target audience can change, right? So you start initially by releasing one country, then a second country, and so on, using one country as a canary, if you like, right? So try out stuff, and then actually going global incrementally. And if you do that quite early, you keep your audience flexible in a way, but also you can nearly assure that you will not have any problems executing code or any impact on the code just by changing internationalization, right? So avoid this tight coupling again. So quality problems in particular. And of course, once you have dealt with this, you should be easily able to adapt your application to even further more countries. So quite straightforward. Please.
One relatively simple way of doing that would probably be to separate the assets that are for all languages, and then the assets that are sounding such that are for only specific languages, and then, for example, have a config file where you take the language and then the path to the folder with that in, and then just have the same structure within each of those subfolders. That sounds like a relatively simple way of doing it, at least.
Yeah. You're fundamentally right. It's effectively how it works under the hood. Precisely. Yeah. So putting everything in resources or assets anyway, where possible, and then structure them systematically, especially if they are language specific or region specific. One aspect you highlighted, which is super important, is to have default assets, right? So, for example, if you have incomplete translations or incomplete mapping between assets and so on, you always want to have a fallback. That's one of the main points. So you made that point very good. So it's quite relevant to bear in mind. Yeah, exactly that. So we'll see a bit more of that later, how it's done in the Android world. But fundamentally, you can apply it to any internationalization pattern, if you like. So in fact, I think it's the only course where we actually talk about it. So it's really worthwhile thinking about this a bit more. So the idea is basically to separate this whole adaptation process or localization process, as you accurately characterized, into two stages. And one of them more is on the application side, where we actually think about marketing, end user, and market penetration in a wider sense. That would be the localization, so adaptation to local circumstances. On the other hand, which counters this, is the internationalization process, where it's you as a developer that you basically realize, okay, hang on, this one is very language specific or culture specific in the widest sense. Which assumptions can I identify that are country specific or culture specific, and can generalize them in a way early on in the development process, so that someone else, not necessarily you or perhaps you, doesn't matter, can actually localize it and flexibly adapt it. So it's actually again two parties dealing with this. Thinking about localization as the developer, but possibly also a non-technical expert, for example, in linguistics or the like, or simply a person that is local to the language. And you, as a developer, that you actually realize which aspects you need to be sensitive to what's relevant for internationalization or not. So that's basically the idea. It's kind of a cyclic interaction where you generalize, internationalize, and then you localize, you adapt to specific instances of local cultures. The idea is to just separate those two those two phases. Cool, right. And they don't need to be symmetric, right? So you can generalize independently of localization, right? So even if you just internationalize, but you only maintain the English language version, that's perfectly fine as well. So it doesn't need to be adapted. but only when the demand arises you can then expose, localize. For example, in the pattern, as you mentioned, having separate asset folders and so on, and uniformly identify them. So sometimes you come across this term of multilingualization. If you didn't understand what I said right now, have a look here. So it's basically a kind of an intermediate step, right? So where we don't really have internationalization in the sense that we can, for example, to runtime switch of languages and cultural properties or formatting conventions and so on. It's not only language. But multilingualization was the first initial step. I think we saw it in Windows one time where you could decide which language you want to install it, but you couldn't really change the language afterwards anymore. So it's like a more hard-coded version of internationalization. So at installation time, if you like, or pretty much at if you would say at kind of compile time internationalization, if you like, whereas true internationalization should allow you to switch the conventions, of course, at runtime as well. So that's fundamentally the idea. So if you come across that term, see it as an intermediate step towards true internationalization. Nowadays, I don't think we find this much anymore. Cool. So what are important factors that we need to bear in mind? It's quite a number of them. In fact, I shouldn't have shown you that slide. Perhaps you come up with some more that are relevant. Of course, the more obvious ones are alphabet or scripts or character sets from a technical perspective, meaning how we represent text from different languages. And you guys know that there are a relatively large number of different character sets out there, right, that are still in use. Some examples.
Japan have like 3 of them.
Oh.
I
Japan?
don't know their names because there are 3 of them.
Okay.
But they have like 3 of them. One of them are for stuff that aren't Japanese, and
I see.
At least one of them are only for Japanese stuff, and then one of them might be for both. What do you know that?
Oh, they're written languages?
Yeah.
Kanji. What was yours again? Katakana and
Okay. Wow. Yeah. So that doesn't make it necessarily easy, right? Is there any effort of integrating them in one character set, or was there any effort?
I don't think so. It's the fact that they have one language that are only used for stuff that aren't Japanese probably helps them keep their culture separated from what isn't Japanese, which probably is something they want, considering they are really big on their culture. So I doubt there are too much work into integrating them there, at least.
Right. So what is the biggest initiative for integrating all possible character sets into one?
You can reach more people, and you can appeal to, or you can more naturally translate what you're trying to get to the user in a way that feels more natural to them if you choose the character set that they are most comfortable with and they would expect it to be in.
True. Yeah. Yeah. It's a valid choice.
Like thinking about Unicode.
Yes. Right. So that's what's the idea there?
When I use Unicode, it's supposed to support more symbols than was often required. But it's like trying to represent. Is it like every character it's trying to represent?
Well, there are different standards level of comprehensiveness in Unicode as well, and it's under constant revision. But the idea is basically to capture any sort of symbol from any language in one character set, ideally.
Does it also have like a numerical ID in a way also, so that this number represents that character?
There's unique identifiers. I forgot the representation. It's not just a numeric representation. I think the identifier is hexadecimal or something, but I wouldn't need to look it up. It's quite a complex setup. But the idea is that the character space is so large that you probably can represent any possible character that is currently in use, including, of course, different variants of Chinese, the simplified one and the traditional one. Perhaps, well, most certainly some aspects of Japanese. I'm not sure how comprehensive of all those 3 character sets are captured as well, for example. But emoticons as well, which is increasingly understood as an international lingua franca, right? So as well for emotions, but also to some extent culture independent, right? So at least if we have a smiley, we kind of get the gist, I guess.
I'm probably wrong, but isn't Unicode support 65,000 characters, or is it a lot more?
I think it's a lot more. Again, there's different variants that have different bit lengths. So when you're in the trade-off to decide which one you want to use, because of course you have a space trade-off versus functionality trade-off, right? So I would need to look up myself. But there's so it's actually a group of standards, not one Unicode
Okay,
thing.
so
But what other historical ones do you know about? What's sorry? TF8. Yeah, it's a subset of Unicode, right? So this is 8-bit, I think. And what else? Come on. Sorry? Ah, finally. Yes, cool. ASCII, right? So the good old character set. If anyone remembers anything from the first character set, it's probably ASCII, right? It's the most simple one. Of course, it's highly non-internationalized, right? So it's a classical example of a character set that is totally or can only support pretty much English plus a little bit left and right, but pretty much the conventional alphabet as we know it in English. So you as Norwegians, you kind of really need to adapt already quite a bit. So a lot of things to consider there. So it's quite important to bear in mind. So Unicode is a safe choice. So you avoid all this character set nastiness that you probably have. So and the efficiency concerns are not so central anymore, especially on mobile devices with the given power right now. Numerals representation, of course, is another aspect. How do we represent numbers? I mean, abstractly thinking about Arabic versions versus the Latin version of numeric representations.
What's the Arabic version?
The Arabic version, the one we use nowadays.
Oh, okay. What others are there?
So in Southeast Asia, you find some different, representations. I'm not sure if Sanskrit had different numeric representations. You guys know it? The Old Indian language, which is basically the ancestor of most South and East Asian languages. So I think they used a different scheme as well. So I haven't seen it in Android applications, admittedly. But at least that's something to consider as well, right? So if you have a local representation, or that's something we need to bear in mind. Numerals also, in terms of formatting, of course, I'll come back to that later again. But if you talk about numerals, it's also about how do you represent, for example, equations. By convention, now I'm getting a catch-up lesson in Norwegian maths courses. So do you use the dot for multiplication or the x for multiplication? The dot, right? Conventionally, right? So whereas in the US you would get, they only use the x notation, for example, right? So that's also, sorry?
That is the US though. They still use like feet and inches and other illogical things.
Yeah, but that's a different problem, right? So that's metric systems or imperial measurement system. Here it's just about notation. Right, so the meaning is equivalent, right? So the feet and meter are not equivalent; they are different metrics, right? So this is, of course, but you're right. This is absolutely here one of those problems as well. If you think about internationalization, absolutely, right? So measurement units, in the widest sense, of course, all applies to it. So you're spot on. Now, here I'm just pointing to simple conventions, right? Just like that, or for example, that we use comma as separator for decimal places, as opposed to the period, right, as in the Anglo-Saxon world. So those kind of conventions. And you
have like the Ascii unit system, which is like a standard for how to measure things.
Yeah, okay, we're going back to fundamental. So the
Ascii unit is basically like how to, it's more like
the base
chemistry
unit
and science and physics. So they have like an Ascii unit system.
Yeah.
Which is where they have like, this is how you measure length, this is how you measure time,
Yeah.
this is how you measure energy. So
Yes.
it has been internationalized.
So that is a perfect example of internationalization, but hardly anyone can read those units, right? So because the idea is that everything, every measure and whatsoever is broken down to 7 base units, right?
Yeah.
That are based on
like,
universal constants.
Yeah, it's incredible like how few units they are breaking them down.
Yes. So, but abstractly thinking, you're spot on, because that's precisely what you do. You abstract from your concrete problem, right? So, and then represent it in a way so you can easily translate it. In practice, you probably still use meters, I guess, right? And do the manual conversion to feet or whatever else, what you need in your target application. But if you want to push it, you can reduce any unit you use to, for example, your SI standards, which, yeah, I don't know. Interesting idea. Perhaps there's a library for that. But I'm somewhat doubtful. But they're thinking spot on, right? So it's precisely that, abstracting from concrete metrics that we use and conventions, both in notation but also in measures and units that we adapt. Talking about conventions, of course, left to right. Beautiful, right? So with the right to left. How is it in Norway? Anyway, so more complex text layouts. That's also one thing. So if you have an ebook reader, right? So and you're obtaining books for reading that. Yeah, please.
Yeah,
Okay.
for example, manga is always read from the right to the left. It still goes downwards, but you have to look at the images to the right first and then to the left if you're going to read the text, because that's how the original authors actually wrote it.
Cool. Nice. Okay. That's a good example. Thank you very much. I'll put this in my repository of narratives. So that's good. Yeah. Yeah. Spot on. Precisely those things. But would they adapt it for different cultures or not?
They translate the texts often, but they do not change how it is, or have to just read it from right to left. So they do not transmit it for different cultures.
Right. Okay. So you need instruction of how to use manga.
Yes. Always remember, read from right to left. Although of course you must remember to see if that makes sense, because it could also just be a comic book that is in the style of a manga, in which case you read it from the left to the right.
Good. So we get an appreciation that culture is not an easy thing, I guess, right? So, but what I want to get here is there are different forms of text layouts, right? So how you, for example, separate flow text paragraphs from headers and so on, header notations and so on. So that's worthwhile to know about as well. So what else is relevant? Plural forms of K in the text output, of course. That is boils down back to translation mostly. Yeah, thinking about keyboard shortcuts, right? So there are different conventions for keyboard shortcuts, and different can be in different languages that are just entrenched. While we're mostly kind of institutionalized in using the Windows conventions, right, and a bit of Unix here and there, there may also be other conventions that are localized and then should be followed as well. Graphic representation of text, of course, and yeah, spoken languages. So that, of course, doesn't only extend to using audio or, of course, translating audio file wherever relevant, but also to only apply audio in context where it's actually appropriate, right? So, for example, different cultures have different preferences for pitches, like high noises or low noises and so on, right? So you want to adapt your audio to those. Okay.
There's also a language where the tone actually changes the meaning of the words, apparently. You're also the only culture where nobody is tone deaf, because being tone deaf there makes it impossible to actually understand what they're saying, apparently. Where normally 2% of the population is tone deaf.
Right. Okay. Just wondering if it's tone deaf. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So like you're thinking about Chinese and Thai.
I don't remember the language. I just remember that there exists one, and that what I remember, my brain didn't apparently pick up on which language it was.
So that's one. I guess that's a challenge to child development, to actually learn the different 5 or 7 pitches or whatever it is, actually differentiate. Yeah, but good point. It's precisely right. So if you get it wrong, so you use a non-native translator, for example, and so on, you have an issue, of course, those cases there. But sometimes also about the aesthetics of what is allowed, what's not, right? So, I mean, if you think about manga again, classic, yeah, please.
You also have an example for games specifically is The Witcher. And when they tried to translate the game to various languages, some Arabic cultures, they had to censor certain parts of it because they are not into the whole females without anything covering them, for example, which with the Witcher 3 game there are some parts of. So they had to do a lot of localization and such there.
Okay, that's interesting. It's a very interesting exotic areas you're exploring. It's probably worthwhile a discussion in its own right, actually. A plethora of different experiences. Yes, but thanks. Yes. So I guess you guys came across various cases, right? So it probably doesn't hurt just to look another, for example, the website of the North Korean standard outlet. You see that the design preferences are quite different from what we're used to when we look at conventional web pages. Anyway, I don't want to push it too far, but you get the gist, right? So different conventions, different preference of people, and so on. Different conventions. Or, for example, if you have character sets that are produced by different keyboard input combinations of standard keyboards, for example, and I think in kanji it's the same, right? So you need to activate this and then have keyboard combinations to produce certain characters.
I think so.
Chinese as well.
Probably.
And of course Arabic, plus the order of writing, right, from right to left. So things can become quite complex and so on. Luckily, I mean, this is basically just the different factors that need to be taken into account. But luckily, most of those are in the meantime taken care of by the operating system by supporting, of course, the character set and also managing keyboard input, right, which are two different problems generally. We usually see them combined because the keyboard represents what we want to type, but it's not necessarily the case, right? Keyboard combinations to produce layout also need to be considered. And yeah, of course, so here, all the kind of stuff you can probably think about. We talked about many of them. So what are, preferred colors, images that you can use, or what are permissible icons you can use in different cultures, of course, and the different meaning they have. For example, I know, for example, that white color generally has a kind of a festive association in most Western cultures, whereas in Chinese it's usually used in funerals, so you kind of want to be careful on that one. Or another one is a beautiful bird called a fantail. It flies around New Zealand quite freely and quite often. They can take pictures of them. They have a beautiful fantail. You would, if you feel inclined, putting it on your webpage is probably not a good idea because for Maori it's a sign of funeral as well. So it's associated with death. It brings death. So bearing those norms, rules in mind is often quite helpful if you want to, of course, do a cross-cultural translation, right? So, but that's more like a marketing problem, I guess, at this stage. I recall some interesting examples of, please.
Another is that the thumbs up doesn't always mean that what it means here. And also that shaking your head or just doing like this doesn't actually mean the same in every culture.
Good point.
So those can be useful to keep in mind if you include them somewhere in your game, as you might accidentally say the opposite of what you want to say. That's right.
It's, yeah, and it's a very good point. A very good point. Reminds me of since we are on the Japan trail of our discussions here, that I think for Chinese New Year they use that as well. Those cat that says hello and wishes you good luck, which in our Western conception would mean goodbye, right? Whereas actually means come here, luck, come here. In our Western conception, we will use a different gesture to emphasize the same thing and wave goodbye instead. So also similar concept that is quite opposite. So so since we digged into the depths of the cultural intricacies, I think we can leave it at that. So, but of course, that's not necessarily always relevant in your application, but where it translates, think about this, right? Names and titles. Government-assigned numbers, of course. What's the format, right? You want to check that, right? For example, the Nummer, right? Or D-Nummer, or the American Social Security number, or any other sort of standard number that may be needs to be localized as a unique identifier because you need to rely on it, right? From a database point of view, it's often sensible to think about a different primary key, auto-generated or not, in addition to that seemingly primary key, right? So, which often is sensible. Postal codes, address formats, of course, inverted or not. Anglo-Saxon again, number first, then street, and so on. Currency symbols, account balances, weights and measures, paper sizes, all that nastiness. So it's an endless list of things to be considered. Oh, date time is one of my favorites. Usually always goes sideways, especially if you have dates with days smaller than 12, right? So and then you confuse the American European system, so it can be confusing. Time zones. And formatting we discussed. Anything else I want to say there? Nope. Different use of quotes. That's right. So different emphasis on the use on quotes. But yeah. So basically that's the thing. So some of them are normative, where it's really about, okay, adapting how people perceive your application and feel comfortable using the application because it feels like their own, right? It has been developed for them, even though it's possibly not. And the rest can also be just be compliance. And that may just fall into, legislative aspect of the target sovereignty you're dealing with. So the example is, if you, for example, show a map of the Kashmir area, right? So to Indians or Pakistani, you want to be cautious how you draw that map. Because depending on the culture, you kind of want to draw it slightly different. I mean, unless you want to engage in a political conflict or have an inherent, want to state facts or whatever else or want to make any claims. But if you just want to get your, app done and show land borders and so on, you kind of want to be acquainted with the Kashmir conflict, right? So to some extent and draw it kind of the right way. So it's politically acceptably locally, right? So it's not here it's not internationalization, that's localization, right? Bringing it back down to local preferences or understanding, right? I could imagine similarly, for example, Russia, Ukraine right now, right? So where should the border be drawn, right? So it's if you want to say I've been in Russia, you kind of, don't want to be censored out immediately, so you probably need to be a bit more accommodating. So what I'm saying is basically, sometimes they are not only normative requirements, but also seemingly legal requirements, how things are to be said and done, especially if it's about dispute. Cool. So that's the legal bit. That's quite relevant and interesting. The other thing, perhaps worth thinking about is worthwhile is pictograms, right? Different meanings for different symbols in different cultures, but also I think even different age groups. But okay, that's quite straightforward. Usually you need a test group to actually assess it. I think that's reasonably straightforward, all taken from airport context. But the good old saving symbol, right? So how does it usually look like if you have an application you want to save something?
A floppy disk?
Yes, exactly. So, but did you actually come across a floppy disk in your real?
No, I do not think so. The only reason I know it is that someone mentioned it at some point, but like young children now will probably, I'm 20 and I haven't probably seen one, or if I have, I will probably not told if it was one.
Yeah.
And people even younger than me probably have no clue what it is and just consider it the default save symbol. Yeah.
Precisely that, right? So some of those symbols are contemporary, right? So they're born out of intuitions at a given time. They were sensible at a given time, right? But it doesn't work anymore. For example, like this is a classic example. And there's now, for example, a new set of icons for, there was some initiative, I forgot what it was, but basically the idea, how can we generalize symbolicism for opening and closing files and manipulating files with symbols? So everyone across all cultures, across all ages understands it because it's intuitive, right? So they tried out different icons to actually test what is generic, because it's actually a problem. So that people see that this button have no clue what it is and just avoid it and constantly go over file save just to be safe. Because they don't want to have unexpected consequences. So that's a classic example where it's not even about culture. In this case, it's about demographic, right? So to be talked about. So you can imagine it's quite important to actually get those pictures right. So if you do it also in game development, of course, test it, right? Ask people what you think. So you actually get the right perspective. Cool. Before I go into that tech perspective a bit more, probably give you a few minutes break. 15 past is sensible, it's survivable. You can take a breath of air. Don't break a window, but a bit of fresh air would be good.
I mean, that's still inside, so it would be very effective.
All right. Okay. Fair enough.